If this is the best candidate the board could find, we are all in serious trouble. The laughter rolled across the polished boardroom before the meeting had even officially begun. It was not loud enough to sound reckless, but it was sharp enough to make everyone understand exactly who the joke was about. Malcolm Hayes stood quietly near the end of the long walnut conference table, wearing a simple navy suit, a white dress shirt, and a modest tie. There was nothing flashy about him. No expensive watch displayed for attention. No designer briefcase placed on the table like a trophy. He simply carried a leather notebook and a pen. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we are glad you are here. Now, back to Malcolm Hayes. The headquarters of Northbridge Technologies overlooked downtown Chicago through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the gray morning sky. Inside the executive boardroom, every chair was already occupied except one near the far end of the table. Senior executives whispered to one another while assistants quietly arranged financial reports and coffee cups. Richard Collins, the company's longtime chief operating officer, leaned back comfortably in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed every conversation in the room eventually belonged to him. As Malcolm walked toward the empty seat, Richard looked him up and down before smiling at several board members. "I thought executive recruiting promised someone with presence," he said with a quiet laugh. "Instead, they sent us someone who looks like he is here to observe the meeting." A few executives chuckled. Others avoided eye contact, pretending to study the documents in front of them. Malcolm paused for only a moment before taking his seat without saying a word. His calmness somehow made the silence heavier. Richard continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "Do not worry. These meetings move quickly. Just try to keep up." Another round of restrained laughter drifted through the room. Malcolm opened his notebook, wrote a single line across the first page, then folded his hands together as though none of the remarks had reached him. Across the table, the corporate secretary quietly glanced at her laptop. "There is a new email from the board of directors marked high priority," she said carefully. Richard barely looked up. "It can wait until after the vote. We have more important business." She hesitated for a second before nodding and closing the notification. No one realized that the unopened message would soon become the most important document anyone in that room had ever ignored. The meeting officially began as charts appeared on the large presentation screen. Richard confidently introduced the agenda, speaking with the certainty of someone already celebrating victory. Every few minutes he directed another dismissive remark toward Malcolm, asking whether he understood the discussion or needed additional explanation. Malcolm never answered with irritation. He simply listened, occasionally writing another brief note in his notebook. One board member watched him with growing curiosity. Another wondered why someone facing such open disrespect refused to defend himself. Malcolm had seen rooms like this before. Different companies. Different cities. Different faces. The assumptions were always remarkably similar. People often decided who belonged before learning who was actually capable of leading. He looked once toward the unopened email notification still glowing quietly on the secretary's screen before returning his attention to the discussion. Outside the boardroom, the city moved through another ordinary business morning. Inside, every careless laugh and every confident assumption pushed the company one step closer to a decision that would cost far more than anyone around that table could possibly imagine. The presentation continued as if nothing unusual had happened, yet the atmosphere inside the boardroom had quietly shifted. Every slide Richard Collins introduced carried the same confident tone, but his attention seemed divided between the financial projections on the screen and the quiet man seated near the end of the table. Every few minutes he glanced toward Malcolm Hayes, almost inviting another opportunity to make him the subject of another joke. "Our next phase depends on decisive leadership," Richard said while clicking to another chart. Not hesitation. His eyes drifted toward Malcolm before returning to the screen. Several executives exchanged restrained smiles, understanding exactly who the remark was meant for. Malcolm remained focused on his notebook. He wrote another short sentence before placing his pen neatly beside the page. He neither defended himself nor challenged anyone across the table. His silence became strangely unsettling because it denied everyone the confrontation they seemed to expect. Linda Foster, the chief financial officer, leaned slightly toward Richard and quietly asked, "Should we review the external partnership proposal before the vote?" Richard dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "The decision has already been made. We are wasting enough time as it is." The secretary glanced once more at the unopened notification resting in the corner of her laptop screen. The subject line remained visible only for a moment before the display dimmed again. She considered mentioning it a second time, but Richard had already resumed speaking. Around the room, directors began discussing projected revenue, expansion targets, and shareholder expectations. Malcolm listened carefully to every opinion without interrupting. He occasionally looked toward the speakers with genuine attention, as though every viewpoint deserved to be heard regardless of how he himself had been treated. One younger board member named Olivia Bennett noticed the contrast. During the previous 30 minutes, Malcolm had been interrupted repeatedly despite speaking only twice. Richard, meanwhile, had spoken almost continuously. The imbalance became impossible for her to ignore. "I think we should hear Mr. Hayes before moving forward," Olivia said cautiously. Richard smiled politely, but the impatience behind his expression was obvious. "There will be plenty of time for observations later." He turned back toward the presentation before Malcolm could even respond. Another executive chuckled softly. "Assuming there is anything to add." Malcolm simply folded his hands together once more. His calm demeanor reminded Olivia of experienced leaders she had admired throughout her career. The strongest voices in difficult rooms were not always the loudest. Sometimes they were the ones disciplined enough to wait until every assumption had revealed itself. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, assistants walked through the executive floor carrying folders and laptops, completely unaware that one unfinished conversation inside would soon reshape the future of the company. Richard advanced to the final financial slide with visible satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced confidently, "after today's vote we can finally move forward without unnecessary delays." Malcolm slowly lifted his eyes from the notebook and looked briefly toward the secretary's computer. The unopened email notification appeared once again as another message entered the inbox. He said nothing. He did not need to. Somewhere behind that unread subject line rested information capable of changing every conversation that had taken place since the meeting began. For the moment, however, the boardroom remained filled with confidence built upon assumptions that had not yet collided with the truth. Richard Collins rested both hands on the conference table as the final discussion began, wearing the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. Around him, several executives nodded in agreement while others quietly reviewed printed financial reports that would soon become meaningless. Malcolm Hayes remained exactly as he had been since the meeting started, sitting upright with calm attention, saying little, observing everything. To Richard, that silence looked like uncertainty. To Olivia Bennett, it looked like discipline. "If there are no objections," Richard announced, "we will move directly to the vote regarding the Horizon Dynamics partnership." The corporate secretary glanced once more toward her laptop before cautiously raising her hand. "There is another reminder regarding the priority email from the board of directors. It appears to require immediate review." Richard let out a quiet sigh, almost amused by the interruption. "The board can wait 10 more minutes. We are perfectly capable of running this meeting without another email telling us how to think." A few restrained laughs echoed around the room. Malcolm briefly looked toward the secretary and gave the slightest nod, not encouraging her to interrupt again, but acknowledging that she had done her job. She slowly lowered her hand and closed the notification for the second time. The unopened message remained hidden behind the presentation software while the discussion continued. Richard stepped toward the large display screen and pointed at a series of projected revenue charts. "The partnership no longer aligns with our strategic direction," he declared confidently. "We have stronger opportunities elsewhere." Malcolm finally spoke for only the third time since entering the boardroom. His voice remained calm, measured, and impossible to mistake for hesitation. Have we considered requesting additional information before making a final decision? Richard smiled without warmth. That would only delay progress. Malcolm answered with the same composed expression. Sometimes patience prevents expensive mistakes. Richard folded his arms. Sometimes hesitation creates them. The room fell quiet again. Olivia noticed that Malcolm never reacted to the personal tone hiding beneath Richard's words. Instead, he simply nodded once, accepting the response without argument. Richard interpreted the silence as surrender and continued leading the discussion. Around the table, directors began preparing their voting documents while assistants collected revised agenda sheets. Outside the glass walls, the skyline shimmered beneath the late morning sun, creating an almost peaceful contrast to the growing tension inside. Malcolm looked briefly through the windows before his attention returned to the boardroom. Years earlier he had sat in conference rooms where people questioned his qualifications before listening to his ideas. He remembered every assumption, every dismissive smile, every meeting where appearance spoke louder than experience. Those memories no longer created anger. They had become quiet reminders that character revealed itself most clearly when respect disappeared. Olivia looked toward Malcolm again. She noticed his notebook remained open to the same page where only 2 short sentences had been written during the entire meeting. Whatever he had written, he never looked back at it. He did not need to. His focus remained on the people around the table rather than the words on the paper. At that exact moment the secretary's laptop produced a soft notification sound for the 3rd time. Another message had arrived in the same email thread from the board of directors. The subject line now displayed a red priority marker. No one except Malcolm and the secretary noticed it. Richard, already preparing the board for the final vote, unknowingly continued speaking over the one message capable of changing not only the outcome of the meeting, but the future of everyone seated in that room. The voting documents were placed neatly in front of every executive, and the atmosphere inside the boardroom grew noticeably lighter. Richard Collins smiled as though the outcome had already become a formality rather than a decision. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit before looking around the table with complete confidence. "We have discussed this long enough," he declared. "It is time to move forward." One by one, board members reached for their voting cards. Some looked certain. Others appeared hesitant, but no one challenged Richard's authority. Malcolm Hayes remained seated quietly, his notebook still open beside him, untouched since the previous discussion. Olivia Bennet looked toward him once more. She had expected him to object or at least request additional review before such a significant vote. Instead, he simply observed the room with remarkable composure. "Mr. Hayes," Richard said with a polite smile that carried unmistakable sarcasm, "this would normally be the point where new participants offer fresh ideas. If you have one, now would be the perfect time." Several executives glanced toward Malcolm. He slowly folded his hands together before answering. "I believe every important decision deserves complete information." Richard let out a quiet laugh. "We already have complete information." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "I hope that is true." Richard stepped away from the presentation screen and stood at the head of the conference table. Enough delays. Northbridge Technologies cannot afford leadership that hesitates every time a difficult choice appears. His words echoed across the room with growing confidence. "We are ending negotiations with Horizon Dynamics effective immediately." Linda Foster shifted uneasily in her chair. "Should we at least confirm whether they have responded to yesterday's proposal?" Richard shook his head without hesitation. "Their silence speaks for itself." Malcolm calmly looked toward Linda before returning his attention to Richard. "Sometimes silence simply means someone is waiting to be heard." Richard smiled again, almost amused. "You certainly enjoy speaking in riddles." Malcolm offered no reply. He simply watched as Richard signed the termination authorization and slid the document toward the secretary. "Please send this immediately after the meeting concludes." She accepted the paper but hesitated. The red priority notification remained visible on the corner of her laptop screen, now blinking more insistently than before. "There is still the board email," she said quietly. "It appears connected to Horizon Dynamics." Richard barely looked at her. "We are done discussing emails." His voice became firmer. "Send the termination notice first." The secretary reluctantly nodded, though her expression revealed growing concern. Olivia noticed it immediately. She also noticed Malcolm watching the exchange with complete calm, as though he already understood something no one else in the room could yet see. The authorization was scanned, attached, and prepared for transmission. Richard looked around the boardroom with visible satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said confidently, "today marks the beginning of a stronger future." He pressed the approval button on the conference tablet in front of him. At nearly the same instant, a soft notification echoed through the room as the secretary's laptop received yet another urgent message in the same unopened email thread. This time the sender's name appeared in bold letters, accompanied by a flashing priority symbol that no one could ignore any longer. The room remained quiet, unaware that within the next few moments every confident assumption, every careless remark, and every decision made during the past hour would begin collapsing under the weight of a single message that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to read it. The conference room remained silent as the secretary looked from the flashing notification on her screen to Richard Collins, uncertain whether she should interrupt again. The subject line now displayed 3 separate priority markers, all from Horizon Dynamics and copied to the board of directors. She quietly cleared her throat. "I truly believe this message cannot wait any longer." Richard exhaled impatiently before leaning back in his chair. "Fine. Read it so we can move on." Every executive shifted their attention toward the secretary as she opened the email that had remained unread throughout the meeting. Her eyes moved across the first paragraph, then suddenly stopped. The confidence disappeared from her expression. She read the opening lines once more before looking up in disbelief. "Is something wrong?" Richard asked, still sounding more annoyed than concerned. The secretary hesitated. "This message was sent 40 minutes ago." Richard nodded impatiently. "Then read it." She took a careful breath. "It is from Horizon Dynamics. They explained that members of their executive team joined this meeting remotely to observe the company's leadership culture before signing the final agreement." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Richard's smile faded slightly. The secretary continued reading. "They state that they witnessed repeated disrespect toward a guest executive, interruptions during professional discussion, and an environment that did not reflect the values required for a long-term strategic partnership." Linda Foster slowly lowered her pen onto the table. Olivia Bennett stared across the room at Malcolm Hayes before looking back toward the secretary. Richard attempted a confident smile. "There must be some misunderstanding." The secretary continued in a steady voice. "The email states that Horizon Dynamics has decided to withdraw from the proposed agreement effective immediately because they believe leadership character is as important as financial performance." She paused briefly before reading the next sentence. "The estimated value of the cancelled partnership exceeds $82 million over the first 3 years." No one spoke. The number seemed to linger in the air long after the words had been spoken. Richard leaned forward. "There has to be another reason." The secretary silently turned her laptop so the executives could read the message themselves. Attached beneath the email was a formal withdrawal letter signed by Horizon Dynamics and copied to every member of the board of directors. Linda quietly whispered, $82 million. Richard looked toward the conference screen where his optimistic financial projections were still displayed. Only moments earlier those numbers had represented future growth. Now they reflected an opportunity that no longer existed. Olivia slowly turned toward Malcolm. Throughout the entire announcement, he had remained exactly as he had been since entering the room, calm, attentive, and composed. He did not celebrate. He did not criticize anyone. He simply listened. Richard finally looked directly at Malcolm for the first time without sarcasm. "Did you know about this?" Malcolm answered honestly. I knew an important email was waiting to be read. I did not know its exact contents. The secretary quietly scrolled farther down the message. There is one more paragraph, she said. Every eye returned to the screen. Horizon Dynamics writes that organizations reveal their true values not when welcoming powerful people, but when meeting someone they believe has no power at all. The room became completely still because every executive understood that those words described exactly what had happened over the past hour, and they also realized that the cost of their assumptions had only just begun to unfold. The silence inside the boardroom lasted so long that the quiet hum of the air conditioning became the loudest sound anyone could hear. No one reached for a document. No one looked at the financial projections still frozen on the presentation screen. $82 million had disappeared with a single email, but the room had not yet absorbed the full weight of what had happened. Richard Collins slowly lowered himself into his chair, staring at the withdrawal letter displayed on the secretary's laptop. The confidence that had carried him through the entire meeting had vanished. Linda Foster finally broke the silence. Was that the only message from the board of directors? The secretary looked back at her inbox. No, she answered quietly. There is another priority email that arrived shortly after the first one. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. Read it. His voice no longer carried authority. It carried uncertainty. The secretary opened the second message. Her expression changed almost immediately. She looked first toward Malcolm Hayes, then toward the directors seated around the table. This message is from the chair of the board, she said. It is addressed to everyone present. She began reading carefully. Effective immediately, the board of directors confirms the appointment of Malcolm Hayes as the new chief executive officer of Northbridge Technologies. This decision follows a unanimous vote completed during last week's executive session and becomes effective upon delivery of this notice. Every face in the room turned toward Malcolm. Olivia slowly smiled, not because she was surprised by his title, but because everything about his quiet confidence suddenly made perfect sense. Richard remained completely still. Linda lowered her eyes toward the table. Several executives who had laughed earlier now seemed unable to meet Malcolm's gaze. The secretary continued reading. Mr. Hayes attended today's meeting as part of the board's planned leadership transition and evaluation process. The board appreciates his professionalism throughout the proceedings and expects every executive to provide full cooperation during the transition. When the reading ended, no one spoke. Malcolm remained seated for another moment before calmly closing his notebook. He had not written another word since the meeting began. He stood slowly, adjusted the front of his jacket, and looked around the room with the same composed expression he had worn from the moment he entered. There was no satisfaction on his face. No trace of revenge. Only quiet purpose. Richard finally managed to speak. You knew. Malcolm answered honestly. I knew the board had reached a decision last week. I did not know when the announcement would be delivered. Richard looked down at the conference table. You could have told us. Malcolm nodded gently. I could have introduced myself by my title. But then I would never have learned how this room treats someone believed to have none. His words settled heavily across the table. Every executive remembered the jokes, the interruptions, the dismissive smiles, and the assumptions made before asking a single meaningful question. Olivia looked toward the old notebook resting beside Malcolm's chair. What were you writing all morning? She asked quietly. Malcolm glanced at the open page before answering. Only observations about leadership. He closed the notebook and rested one hand upon it. Financial reports reveal how a company performs. People reveal what a company truly values. No one challenged him because the events of the morning had already provided all the evidence anyone could possibly need. The leadership transition had officially begun, but the greatest change taking place inside the boardroom had nothing to do with a new title. It was the sudden realization that respect offered only after discovering someone's position was never genuine respect in the first place. No one reached for a coffee cup. No one turned another page of the financial reports. The boardroom that had echoed with quiet laughter less than an hour earlier now felt completely different. Every executive seemed to be replaying the morning in silence, remembering each interrupted sentence, every dismissive glance, and every assumption they had made before learning who Malcolm Hayes really was. Richard Collins slowly stood from his chair. His confident posture had disappeared, replaced by visible humility. For several moments he searched for the right words but found none. Finally he looked directly at Malcolm. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not because of your title. Because of the way I treated you before I knew anything about you." Malcolm listened without interrupting. Richard continued, his voice steady but noticeably softer than before. "I decided who you were before you spoke your first complete sentence. I believed appearance told me everything I needed to know. I was wrong." The room remained silent. Linda Foster nodded slowly. "We all participated in it," she admitted. "Some of us spoke. Others stayed quiet. Neither response reflected the kind of leadership we claim to value." Olivia Bennett looked around the conference table. Silence can become agreement when no one is willing to challenge disrespect. Several board members lowered their eyes. They recognized themselves in those words. Malcolm walked slowly toward the large windows overlooking the Chicago skyline before turning back toward the room. "Every organization develops a culture," he said calmly. "The difficult question is whether that culture exists only inside policy manuals or inside everyday conversations." No one answered because everyone understood the difference. Richard took a careful breath. "If there is anything I can do to begin repairing the damage, I am willing to do it." Malcolm studied him for a moment before responding. "Repair begins with honesty, not excuses." Richard nodded immediately. "Then honestly, I allowed confidence to become arrogance. I confused authority with leadership." Malcolm gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Recognizing that difference is an important first step." Linda quietly closed her laptop. "The partnership may be gone," she said, "but perhaps we still have an opportunity to change the company that lost it." Malcolm smiled gently. "That opportunity still exists every single day." He returned to the conference table and rested one hand on the back of his chair. "I did not come here looking for people who never make mistakes. I came looking for people willing to learn from them." Olivia noticed that his words carried no bitterness. There was disappointment, certainly, but it was balanced by purpose rather than resentment. Richard looked toward the unopened notebook Malcolm had carried throughout the meeting. "Will today's observations remain in that notebook?" he asked. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Some of them." Richard looked concerned. Malcolm continued before anyone could misunderstand. "Not as a record of failures. As reminders of the kind of leadership we must choose from this moment forward." The executives slowly looked at one another. For the first time that morning, conversations were no longer shaped by job titles or assumptions. They were shaped by accountability. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected against the glass towers surrounding headquarters, while inside the boardroom an even more important change had begun. The company's future would not be determined by the email that had cost millions of dollars. It would be determined by whether the people sitting around that table possessed the courage to become better than the versions of themselves who had entered the meeting only a few hours earlier. The meeting did not end when the conversation stopped. Instead, it entered a different chapter. Malcolm Hayes slowly walked back to the head of the conference table, not because the new title entitled him to the seat, but because the board had entrusted him with the responsibility that came with it. He rested his notebook on the polished wood and looked around the room. The expressions looking back at him no longer reflected certainty. They reflected expectation. "I appreciate every apology offered today," Malcolm began calmly. "They matter because they show a willingness to change. But apologies alone do not transform organizations. Daily decisions do." Every executive listened without interruption. Richard Collins remained standing instead of returning to his chair, choosing to listen rather than defend himself. Malcolm continued in the same measured voice that had remained steady throughout the morning. This company did not lose a partnership because someone made one careless joke. It lost trust because several people watched respect disappear and accepted it as normal. Linda Foster nodded slowly. That is difficult to hear, she admitted. Malcolm answered with a gentle smile. Growth often begins with difficult truths. He opened his notebook for the first time since becoming chief executive officer. Several executives expected to see pages filled with names and criticism. Instead, they saw only a handful of short observations written across a single page. Malcolm read one sentence aloud. The way we treat the quietest person in the room reveals more about our culture than the way we greet the most powerful one. He closed the notebook again. That sentence is not about today alone. It is about every meeting we will ever hold. Olivia looked around the conference table. How do we make certain this never happens again? Malcolm answered without hesitation. We build a culture where every voice receives respect before every title receives recognition. Richard took a careful breath. If you believe I can still contribute to that culture, I am willing to earn back the trust one lost today. Malcolm studied him for a moment before replying. Trust is rebuilt through consistency. Not promises. Richard nodded. Then that is where I will begin. Malcolm looked toward the secretary. Please schedule a leadership workshop for every executive team member. Not because the board requires it. Because we do. The secretary smiled for the first time that morning as she noted the request. Linda quietly added, perhaps every future executive interview should include observation of how candidates treat people throughout the building, not only inside formal presentations. Malcolm smiled. That is an excellent place to start. The atmosphere inside the boardroom gradually became lighter. The financial loss still existed. The cancelled partnership could not be recovered with a conversation. Yet something equally valuable had begun to emerge. Executives who had entered the meeting focused entirely on numbers were now discussing values with the same seriousness. Malcolm looked once more through the windows overlooking the city before turning back toward the team. A successful company is not measured only by quarterly reports, he said. It is measured by whether people leave our offices feeling respected regardless of their position, appearance, or background. Every person around the table understood that those words were no longer theoretical. They had lived through the consequences of forgetting them only hours earlier. The leadership transition had become more than a change in title. It had become the beginning of a different standard, one built not upon authority alone, but upon dignity, accountability, and the simple decision to see every person before judging them. By late afternoon, the boardroom looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The polished conference table still reflected the sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The presentation screen still displayed financial charts waiting to be replaced. Coffee cups remained scattered around the room. Yet every person sitting there knew that nothing about the company was truly the same anymore. Malcolm Hayes looked around the table before gathering his notebook and placing it inside his leather portfolio. The meeting had begun with assumptions. It would end with understanding. Richard Collins slowly stood once more, this time not to lead the room, but to acknowledge it. I spent years believing leadership meant always having the strongest voice, he said quietly. Today I learned that real leadership begins by listening before speaking. Malcolm nodded respectfully. That lesson is worth more than any title. Linda Foster closed the final financial report and smiled gently. We can recover revenue, she said. Recovering trust requires something much greater. Malcolm agreed. Trust is built one respectful conversation at a time. He looked toward the secretary, whose willingness to raise the unread email several times had almost been overlooked during the meeting. Thank you for continuing to do your job even when your concerns were dismissed, he said. She smiled with quiet appreciation. I was only trying to help the company. Malcolm answered, that is exactly what leadership looks like. Olivia Bennett looked around the room and noticed something that had not existed earlier that morning. No one interrupted anyone else. No one rushed to dominate the conversation. Every voice received the same attention regardless of position or seniority. The culture had not changed because policies were rewritten. It had begun changing because people had chosen to change. Malcolm walked toward the large windows overlooking Chicago before turning back to face his new executive team one final time. "Today cost this company an extraordinary opportunity," he said calmly. An email revealed the financial consequences of poor judgment. But the greater lesson was never about money. Every executive listened carefully. The most expensive decision any organization can make is deciding someone's value before taking the time to understand their character. The moment respect depends upon appearance, assumptions, or titles, leadership has already failed. His words settled quietly across the room. Richard looked down briefly before meeting Malcolm's eyes again. "I will remember that every day I walk into this building." Malcolm smiled warmly. Then today was not a complete loss. Outside, employees continued arriving for afternoon meetings, unaware of the remarkable transformation that had taken place behind the closed boardroom doors. They would never know every conversation that had unfolded or every uncomfortable silence that had changed the course of the company. What they would notice in the weeks ahead was something much more important. They would notice leaders who listened more carefully, welcomed different perspectives, encouraged respectful discussion, and judged people by integrity rather than appearance. As Malcolm reached the doorway, he paused for one final moment and looked back across the room that had tested his patience before recognizing his leadership. His voice remained calm, steady, and unforgettable. Respect should never begin after someone reads your business card. It should begin the moment another human being walks into the room. Titles can earn attention. Success can earn admiration. But character is the only foundation strong enough to build lasting leadership. Never underestimate a person because of what you assume you see. The greatest opportunity you lose may never be measured only in dollars. It may be measured by the leader you failed to recognize standing right in front of you.